Welcome to the Silver River Chairs channel. Today we're going to be working on Hans Wegner's Round Chair, a beautiful piece that was actually used in the first televised debate between Nixon and Kennedy. And we just saw this chair, the actual chair, in DC. We're using a 5mm binder cane, and you want to soak for about 10 to 15 minutes until it's good and pliable. One coil might get you there, but get a couple just in case, because there can be waste because of the way that this chair is set up. This chair was originally would have tacks along the bottom. We have actually filled the tack holes with some epoxy, and we'll go back in with pneumatic staples. It causes less damage to the chair and holds the material a little tighter. We're not going to be tacking it all for a while. That's something that you want to do at the very end. In the meantime, we're going to use these guys that will clamp the material onto the rail and mimic what tacking would do. You want a clamp plate that's a little flexible. This is a composite material. Fits front and fits back. We'll need 4 of those. Using 4 spring clamps, a flat-headed screwdriver, and a small hammer. Just soak a few strands at a time for right now. It's important to take a picture of your chair before you get started. Take extensive notes. They're super helpful. Take a lot of pictures. And I'm going to turn it over to Brandy for an explanation of the pattern.
So the weave is fairly simple. It's a plain weave, but with some tricks around the edges and this slot that you have to thread the binder cane through on all 4 sides with a trick at the back. These crisscrosses here are important. I've marked over here where there are some inconsistencies. This is similar to hand-woven chair caning. When you have a pair coming out of this little square, you can see one strand comes under the outermost pair and the other strand goes on top of this outermost pair. The shorter bit is the one that comes under. The longer bit of the X is the one that goes on top of the outermost warp strand. This shorter pair should cross over the longer pair. Shorter pair, longer pair. Short over long. If you don't do that, then your material can shift around. Here, the last weaver did long over short, and you can see it slides. Here, they did it correctly, gets bumped right in there, not moving. These 2 are incorrect, and that can just shift all over the place. This one is correct. It bumps right in. Incorrect, slides all the way to here, where the longer one went over the short. Should be the opposite. Traps this piece in. So we need to pay attention to that when we're doing our new seat. So this is true on all 4 sides of the chair. This is the short leg. It comes underneath the outermost pair. This is the longer leg. It comes on top of the outermost pair. So short over long, short over long, short over long. Happens on the side, happens in the back. Short over long every time. To pry up this half round reed. Just loosen it and then use your handy nail pullers to. Once you remove the reed, you can see all these lovely tacks. Looks like somebody had come in here at one point and added some patches, but the rest of the chair was starting to break, so we're going in. We have to take all these tacks out. On this side, you can see how it's attached. These are silica side out. These are the raw side out. You can see all along this edge how much wood the tacks take out of the frame. If there are big chunks missing, you want to fill them in with some epoxy. If any nail heads broke off, then we'll hammer those down flush. I left these 2 tacks because I wanted to show how to start and stop. This is a good trick that we like to use to try to keep the material from splitting. Masking tape around the ends. It's the middle of this X. Push it through. Push again. It's the outside of the X, but it's the inside of the woven pair. Pushing on the next end, I feel it's the outside of the X, the inside here, and the outermost woven pair. So there's a lot of crisscrossing we have to pay attention to. Taking notes is important when you reverse engineer. Don't just cut it apart.
I love this chair. It's such a good chair. I really want one of these chairs. If you guys have any extras and you want to donate it.
The first thing we're going to do is put in a spacer right in the center of the chair where this handy dandy handle lives. We're using tape for this demonstration so that we can remove the material. We're actually working on a book where some detailed instructions for this chair are going to reside. Normally we would be stapling or tacking at this point, but you're going to be seeing this blue tape. So on the front hand side, you can kind of see where some of the old tack holes are. I'm going to pretend like that's a tack, tape on, and you can also see where these wraps used to live. So here we've got an important tip. I'm going to make a little divot here, muscle memory, so that the material stays flat once this wrap comes on. Doesn't matter which side you're on, it's going to be a little wonky here in the middle, and then we'll tape it actually on the side. Here on the back, there's another spacer, and similar to the front, where it isn't pulled too taut. So I'm wrapping the spacer around the back side, and I'm kind of holding on the front as well. So I'm wrapping around the rail on the back side and not through the slot. Here's another spot because of the ledge. I want to give this material a little bit of muscle memory, similar to the other side. I'm going to go there as well. Okay. So here's the front side where it's slotted through, and it might look wonky on the front, but the rest of the strands as we weave through is going to make it hold it in place. Blue tape instead of a tack. We'll be laying the warp in first and then coming through with the weavers or the weft afterward. So these are the first two warp strands. You're always going to start in the middle. These are the only strands that are going to be connected to this central post. I'm using long strands. That gives me the ability to shift side to side if needs be and avoid tricky leaf nodes. You definitely don't want them showing up right on an edge or those leaf nodes ending on the top of the seat close to the front edge where most of your weight is. Now, leaf nodes occur every 8 to 10 inches on your material. You can't avoid them, but if you have any that are already compromised, you want to avoid them. First two warp strands are going to be tacked, and in our case, taped to this central post on either side of the spacer. So here, as I've tape tacked these in, I realized, oh gosh, I've got a leaf node right here where I need to crease it. And there's a leaf node here, and I'd prefer not to have leaf nodes showing on these first three strands. Great reason to tape and not tack to start out with. So I'm going to drag these guys back a little bit further. Starting out with this right strand, coming around the front of the chair and through the slot. Leave some tension because there's going to be a lot of strands woven through these guys. On the front, I'm going to do a single wrap and then back through. This is where the very important crisscross happens. It doesn't matter whether you go left over right or left under right, but for this particular project, we're going to take the strand left under right. And it's very important to be consistent all the way across the chair. Okay, I've gone under, pull the extra strand through, and then I'm back over the top and headed towards the front rail. Working strand under, and then back over and to the front rail. Here we go to the left side of the spacer. The first of the pair that we laid in and the wrap, and then the working strand that we wrapped around the first one and then wrapped around the rail. So these guys are going to squish together and hold that filler strand nice and straight. All right, I've got my next pair of warp strands through the slot. And we're going to give it some slack down here. The left side of the pear, we're going to wrap around and through. That's going to give you the spacer in between the two. This first strand, and I'm coming to the front of the chair with it. Left hand part of the pear through the front slot. Make sure you're leaving slack and spacer. So the right portion of this pear, I'm going to go over the left, matching the previous one, and then under at the front rail, make sure there's good slack through the front slot without crimping the material, and a spacer. I'm going to nudge these guys together and then use another clamp plate on the front rail. So the uniqueness of this pattern and that the weird twisting we did in the warp is so that when the weft strands are woven through, that they lock the pattern in place. Not only on the front, but we'll have pairs of weft strands, standard over-under pattern, and that's going to lock in at the back as well. You can check the pattern by weaving these through every once in a while and making sure that you're locked in, or you can leave them in place and then just mimic this crisscross as you're filling in warp strands. If you're going to leave these guide strands in place, I would suggest doing a front pair and a back pair. I personally prefer to put all the warp strands in without the guide strands. So we're going to continue putting warp strands in to the right and then jump and go to the left. Putting in the next pair of warp strands. All right, I'm going to keep filling in warp strands, moving to the right and then to the left. You may remember from your notes that on the back rail you have a central spacer, but most of the time not a side spacer. On the front, you have a central spacer and a side spacer. In order to determine if you need to add spacers in between the pairs, if you subdivide the rails, put a mark in the middle and put a mark kind of at the quarter points. And if your front rail is filling up faster than the back rail, then you start adding some extra spacers on the back rail so that you reach the end point at the same time. Flip the chair around so you guys can see on the front side. Last one, don't forget the crossover here. And double checking. Yes, all right. Now here's the real challenge. Get that last strand through. So I wove in a couple of test strands to make sure that all of my crossovers are correct. Everyone is locked in, and you can slide the pair to the back. Everything is locked in here in the back as well, so we're good to go. I'm going to continue on to the other side. All right, working on the last pair on the other side. And it is pretty tight. You can always scoot things around using a screwdriver. Not only do you have to adjust on the front, but the back as well in order to make space. All right, I'm going to add the test strands in on the back and the front of the chair in order to make sure that all of my wraps are consistent. This might help to spread the pairs apart a little bit in order to get them to slide, or get the weaver to slide through. And on this back rail especially, you can see how they're starting to overlap and it's not quite covering up the rail as much. You can start to play with that and adjust the wraps as needed. Once the rest of the weaving is in, it'll be easier to make those adjustments. Okay, I've woven a dowel through now, matching the pattern of the bottom part of the pair. We're going to have 14 pairs on the side according to our notes. So I got 13 strands. Going to become one part of that pair. Moving through, pull the dowel out, and I'll take this tape off. All right, I've grabbed one strand, pulling all the way to the front. And double checking, making sure everything is captured. Good. So that's the bottom part of the pair. So all of these guys are consistent, that it's trapping the strand. This one, if we don't like the look of it once it dries, then we can replace it. And along those lines, this with the leaf node right here that can catch, this one here, this one here. This is the reason we leave the strands long and don't staple or tack yet, because we can adjust that so that the leaf nodes are landing in a better spot. I'm weaving in the top of this front pair. And these do have a tendency to cross over each other. So let's make sure that a pair is a pair. Here we have just wove in the top of this pair, and each one of these strands that I've already woven in becomes the bottom of the next pair. Instead of having to weave another pair in, you just slide these down into place, and you're only having to weave in the top of each pair. The side wraps are identical to the front. You want to make sure that you're trapping the outermost strand. There'll be a central spacer and a side spacer. There'll be no spacer right next to the front post. When you go to replace a strand, make sure you got the right one, and then clip it in a few spots across the chair. Then you can remove the smaller pieces and not have to remove the entire piece all at once. Wet the area you're weaving through liberally, and keep the weaving strand that you're working with good and wet also. You only want to be weaving over and under a couple of strands at a time, and then pulling a length through. Pull a lot more length through than you think you need. There is a chance that that working end can snap off on you. And as you're creating these loops, try not to let that loop bend way back on itself. That's also another spot that can break. And bark, bark, bark is the fluffy. Bark, 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 it's stars. Bark's over here. Bark's over here. Bark, 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 it's stars. Make sure the wraps and crossovers and spacers are consistent, and this would have been a lot more difficult if we had already had things stapled down, so wait till the end. We've done a lot of weaving. Almost all of the pairs in have spent a lot of time adjusting making the pattern as uniform as possible. You can choose to wait until the very end to wrap them all. I was able to use the caning needle up to this point. This is probably the last time because it was awfully tight. When you're using the caning needle, make sure you get this very wet. I had to cut a notch out of it so that it will fit into the caning needle slot. You want to make sure your strand is very wet as well, especially here on the end. And then pull it like you mean it. And I think I got 2 more pairs left. And I might try the caning needle one more time. All right. Pushing my luck. That was pretty tight. Feeling pretty good about it. The fact that I got the caning needle through bodes well. And so that's the top pair. One more from that we wove in at the beginning. All right, we're officially down to our last pair. I've just got a little bit of space on both rails, so I'm going to weave through by hand. Using what we call the inchworm method, and that's with a 6 or 8 inch working end, and you're weaving with the working end and then pulling the strand through. Now, because this material is bent and is kind of crunchy, you may lose some length. So make sure that you have a lot of extra length and that you're pulling a lot of that extra length through to this side as well, so that if this end bit that you're using to weave with starts to break apart, that you can cut it off and you still have plenty of length. We've laced the last pair, and this is the spacer wrap. But I've got a spacer wrap from the back pair that I wove in at the very beginning. You don't want 2 spacer wraps next to each other, so I'm going to unlace this pair and put this spacer wrap on the back. On this side, I've just barely got enough space to do the pair and the wraps, but I'm going to bump all these over and make space for another spacer wrap in addition so that it matches the other side. So we're almost ready to staple these guys to the rails here, but first we want to make sure that they are good and moistened so that they don't crack, which I've had a couple crack already, and I'm going to have to replace those strands, but that's how it goes. So I'm focusing on attaching the back first, and before we do any attaching, I want to make sure that all the strands are in good shape. So we'll start on this side. This one has a crack that wasn't there, or I didn't notice it, so I'm gonna have to replace that. These guys had run up on top of each other. We'll fix that in a minute. And this guy right here is not attached on the bottom yet. It goes to the center post. Okay, where this is a little bit of a dent, I'm gonna give it spritzy and kind of massage that dent out. After a close inspection on the top side, I had to replace several strands that weren't quite worthy of this chair. Now we're back to the point where we're ready to do some attaching of the strands to the rail. We're using a pneumatic stapler. I set a couple test staples just to make sure I wasn't blasting through the material. So I'm going to start on one end and then jump to the other and kind of meet in the middle here. I'm pulling this strand and pushing on the back rail before I attach, making sure that this is pulled taut to the rail. Right, we've got some masking tape. Cut it down the center here. Chisel, hitting downward and not sideways. So you bend the material over the rail, crease it with the screwdriver, wrap tape around that crease, and hold it down with a screwdriver, staple, and chisel off at the end. The wrapping on the central stretcher is a decorative way to clean up these ends of the spacers and the initial strands. Start with a staple on the side instead of on the ledge, and wrapping tightly with a long strand, much longer than you think you'll need. And make sure you inspect it for any imperfections before you get going. Here's a little trick we learned from Mies van der Rohe chairs. Instead of ending with a tack, we're going to tuck the tail under the last two wraps. When you do that, it kind of forms a little bit of a kink at the end. Just smooth that kink out using a tool, an awl of some sort, however you can make it happen. And when you're cutting the tail, make sure you're pulling the cane against the blade and not the blade against the cane. Soak the 3/8 inch half round reed for about 20 minutes and cut to length, accounting for the angles at the posts. Mark the tack holes in between the cane strands and pre-drill those holes so that the reed doesn't split. We're using a 3/4 inch brass tack and only hammer them in part way at first. Be careful when you're hammering in the brass tacks, they're bendy. A bent over tack can damage the reed. The half round reed and the cane are pretty bright at this point, but they're going to age to a nice golden brown. Don't pull on those sticky up cane fibers. Clip them with a small pair of scissors or beard trimmers. And that's it, guys. Hopefully the chair gods are kind to you. This one is trickier than it looks. Thank you for watching the Silver River Chairs channel. Like, subscribe, and make sure to share with all your chair nerd friends.
And stay tuned for our instructional book coming in 2023. Likely the end of 2023, but it's close. Seriously, if y'all want to donate a chair, we'll give you a free class. And check out this great book on all of Hans Wegner's chairs. Thanks for watching the Silver River Chairs channel.